Long, long ago, far, far away. That sounds like the start of a fairy tale, doesn't it? Well, maybe it wasn't that long ago. Maybe it wasn't that far away. But this story is true. We were living out in the midst of farmland, a fairly remote place, fields all around us. In fact, our property was like 30 acres, and most of that was in hay or pasture. Field right beside us had been a cotton field. I don't remember what was across the highway. This was, I'm going to say mid-December. I know it was after all the harvest and everything. I had been away just a few weeks before to a men's week. And one of the preachers there, a very powerful preacher, challenged all of us. Do you have all on the altar laid? Well, he was so powerful that night. And in his presentation, he says, well, if you feel convicted, there are plenty of rooms here where you can go and pray. He had to cut his message short, that many people left the auditorium. Now, I was one of those people, and I knew that my all had to be given. So I get back home, and this particular week, well, I worked about 4 hours away from the house, so I left on a Tuesday morning, didn't get back till Friday night. But this particular weekday, mid-morning or something, I got a call from my wife saying, we've just been evacuated from our house. The fields are on fire, and the firemen have said they cannot save the house. You can imagine what was going through our minds and through our hearts. So I knew that there were some of the folks at work that were believers, that were willing to pray, so I went to them and said, this is happening. And they said, well, why aren't you leaving? Why aren't you rushing home? I said, well, there's really nothing I can do in that, and who knows what God will do. And it just spoke to all of us. My wife and the family obviously made it out of the house safely, and were over to neighbors where they could see what was going on. Well, I want to make the statement that I am a servant of God. I am living for Him and for His kingdom. I've chosen to read 2 Corinthians 12, verses 4 through 11. Now there are different gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different ministries, but the same Lord. And there are different activities, but the same God is active in everyone and everything. A manifestation of the Spirit is given to each person to produce what is beneficial. To one is given a message of wisdom through the Spirit. To another, a message of knowledge by the same Spirit. To another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another, the performing of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, distinguishing between spirits. To another, different kinds of languages. To another, interpretation of languages. But one and the same Spirit is active in all these, distributing to each one as He wills. The message that I want to present to you this morning is one that I've titled, Our Personal Call from God. Each of our calls is personal, and I think that we will see this. One of the books that I was reading recently is titled, Is God Calling Me? In there, the author presents that God gives three basic kinds of calls. The first one is a universal call to each and every one of us, a call to service and a call to growth. The other two, which, since I got your curiosity up, Basically, the call to ministerial leadership, which only some receive, and then calls to a specific ministry, which even fewer people receive. But those are the three that he lays out. But I think that we can see that in our personal calls, growth and service, there's a lot of room there for each one of us to be responding in. I liken the calling to an illustration I believe all of you have heard, or at least I suspect you've heard, that of a contract or a covenant, where God presents a piece of paper, says a contract between God and your name. And then down at the bottom is a place for you to sign. And he gets this contract and hands it to you. Everything in between it blank. You don't see the terms and conditions. You don't see what's being offered. You don't know what it is. But God has presented it to you, asking you to make that covenant, that contract with him. Now we know from his word all the promises that he has for us, the things that come with obedience, the things that come with surrenderedness. But we don't know the specifics of what he is calling us to. But he has called us. He has called each and every one of us. Another way that I saw this presented was in a prayer out of the book Experiencing God. I guess you've probably seen the notices that I'm going to be teaching that series Wednesday evenings. But anyway, Lord, I will do anything your kingdom requires of me. Wherever you want me to be, I'll go. Whatever the circumstances, I'm willing to follow. If you want to meet a need through my life, I am your servant, and I will do whatever is required. Have you signed that contract to be who and what God wants you to be? Have you been willing to give up all of those things that are your own personal desires? Surrender them to God? Have you been willing to give up your homes, your family, your job? You know, that's just a little bit of what God's calling is in surrendering everything. The other part of his calling is, what are you doing for him? What are you willing to do for him? What of the things that he has asked you to do have you given in and done? Sometimes it is a giving in, isn't it? We sit back and want to holler and scream and say, no, Lord, not me. I'm not the one for that. But God puts his finger on you and says, yes, you are. How long did Moses say, no, I can't speak, I can't do this? You want me to lead your people? You've got to be kidding me. And God says, no, you are the one. How many times have you been to a place where God has called you to do something? And you still say, no, I'm not the one. I don't know how to do that. And God continues to say, yes, you are. And you finally say, okay, I will. And then God has given you everything that you have needed to be able to do what he's called you to. God does not necessarily call the equipped. He does sometimes. But he will always equip the called. Always. If he is your person for that job, or if you are his person for that job, he will give you what you need to accomplish it. There are many times when your skills, your interests, your abilities, your experiences are things that God does use to accomplish something he wants. There are many times and places where having that experience, having that interest, makes it easier for you to volunteer, perhaps, for something that he may have for you. You know, we are presented with all kinds of opportunities. We have a tremendous experience or a tremendous time here at Winchester First right now. We are in a period of real change. There are things that perhaps you can just step up for, you can volunteer for, you can express your interest in, that maybe God is actually calling you to be a participant in. Maybe one of your brothers or sisters is going to walk up to you, tap you on the shoulder, and ask you to participate in something that you've never been part of before. That may be a call from God. Maybe you've experienced things like that before. I do my very best to say, if somebody taps me on that shoulder, that I must consider that a calling from God and must seriously consider it. I try very hard not to turn down something of that sort. It does happen. There are times when it really does not work. But those times are a whole lot less than we'd like to think they are. Our personal wills and desires can interfere so often with what God is asking us to do. It so often takes a real deliberation or a real deliberate decision on our part to say, yes, Lord. Do we take the time in our desire to follow God to actually look and see where it is that God is working? Sometimes we get these ideas that this is where God ought to be, or this is where God wants us to be, but God's not working there. Or not working strongly there. Maybe he's got something else going where he's really being active, and he's calling you to participate where he is. Are you willing to give up that other thing to join him where he is working? Here, now, we've got changes being made in committees. Kind of settled down for this year for a lot of things. But it won't be long before our nominating committee, and in particular, but not limited to that, will be asking, well, we need new people because some are leaving at the end of term. We tend to have a fair amount, well, sometimes it looks like a fair amount of turnover in our people. And they've got a spot now that needs to be filled. If you are asked, will you consider it? Teaching positions come up now and then. Sunday school, Wednesday evenings, things of that sort. Are you willing to consider it? Are you willing to volunteer for it? And if you accept these things that God calls you to, are you willing to put the time and effort into it? It's a calling from God. Our lives are being called. Our lives matter. We grow through these things, which is one of the things that God has called us to, is growth. He's also called us to service. So are we going to serve? Is God calling you to be a prayer warrior? We know so many things in our congregation that do need prayer. We've got lots of people that are sick. We've got lots of people that are struggling. We've got lots of decisions that need to be made. We've got a future that's unknown to us. God is calling us to participate in what he is doing. Many, many different ways of doing that. We also have programs in our church for ministry within the walls and ministry without the walls. Are you willing to participate in that? Oh, how easy it is to step back and say, let somebody else do it. I'm not interested. I don't have the time. Yes, I'm guilty. But if God is calling this congregation to that kind of work, if he's calling his people to that kind of work, isn't he also calling you and I to participate in it? One of the things that I came across, or was introduced to a few years ago, is a song, and hopefully I've printed it large enough I can read it up here. It's titled, "Here I Am, Lord." I, the Lord of sea and sky, I have heard my people cry. All who dwell in dark and sin, my hand will save. I, who made the stars of night, I will make their darkness bright. Who will bear my light to them? Whom shall I send? Here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me. I will hold your people in my heart. I, the Lord of snow and rain, I have borne my people's pain. I have wept for love of them, they turn away. I will break their hearts of stone, give them hearts for love alone. I will speak my word to them. Whom shall I send? Here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me. I will hold your people in my heart. I, the Lord of wind and flame, I will tend the poor and lame. I will set a feast for them, my hand will save. Finest bread I will provide, till their hearts be satisfied. I will give my life to them, whom shall I send? Here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me. I will hold your people in my heart. That has been a real challenge to me. And I think it's safe to say that that is one of the reasons, if you'll accept the word reason, that I'm standing before you today. God has called. It's my desire to answer that call, to respond to it, to be who God has called me to be working where God is working, to serve, to grow. Now perhaps you'd like to hear the rest of the story that I started off with. A few hours later, I got another call back from my wife. And she said, well, the fire department was out. They had I think it was disked the ground next to the lane. They still, at the time they did that, had no expectation of it doing anything except maybe slowing the fire down a little bit. The fire came down through that cotton field, down along the edge of the lane, down underneath an old trailer house that was sitting on the property, went on past it without catching it on fire, went down the lane, past the house, went past the barn, none of the hay, nothing was burned, went out into the backfield, went past the beehives, didn't bother them at all, and went roaring on out the back of the pasture into the neighbors. I think it went through 3 or 4 other neighbors' fields before it finally went out. As far as I know, the greatest damage that was probably done, at least it was done to our property, was when the firemen cut the back fence to get on through and continue chasing it. You know, it's a mighty God we serve. God called, I believe, particularly looking back on it, me to give that testimony to the people I was working with. To be able to give a testimony of a mighty God that we serve, that he can be trusted, that he can be rested in. Testimony is one way of serving God. It's one of the things he calls us to. How many times in the scriptures has he mentioned, write this down for a testimony? Put this there for a testimony. Are you willing to give your testimony? So many different ways to answer God's call. So many variations in the way that God presents his calling to us, his desires to us. It is simply our responsibility to see the lines as they're written on that contract and to respond in a positive fashion to it. Now I'd like to offer you an invitation. The invitation is that you look seriously at that contract that God has laid before you. Have you signed that in a positive, bold fashion? Yes, God, I will do what you are calling me to. Not always easy, but always rewarding. If you have not yet signed that contract, if you are not yet a believer, there is still time. There is still opportunity. God is still calling you to sign that contract. To give your love, give your heart in service to him. He wants that kind of a relationship with you that will satisfy the needs of his kingdom, that will satisfy his desire of a relationship with you. Please respond to him. Please say yes. I want to sign that contract. I am signing that contract. I am giving my all to you. If you have not been faithful in your term, in responding to the terms of your contract with him, will you confess it? Will you surrender? Will you give your all to him?